Hello everyone and welcome to the 33rd Daily Critique, where today I'm going to be discussing 5 images by Renee Rivera. They're all from the west coast of the US. We've got some nice photos of the Sierras here, and they're all taken to a very high standard, I have to say. But I think there are some editing changes that I would make myself. So we're going to discuss sort of more finessed editing, some of the finer issues around colour and contrast and so on, and just hitting that perfect sweet spot when you're editing your images. So let's get started. So here are Renee's images, more wonderful shots here. As a general point, I'm being slightly spoilt by you guys in terms of the standard of photography that I'm getting generally. So if you're a beginner or an intermediate and you don't have photos of this standard, then don't be put off sending them in to me. Because I think in some cases, this being one, we've got some very capable photographers sending their images in for critique, and I wouldn't necessarily say that this is typical of the standard that I would necessarily expect, and the fact that I'm still managing to find points of critique is well, hopefully won't put you off submitting your own. But anyway, let's get started with these. And I've got them all open in Photoshop. So what I'm going to do is zip through the compositions quickly, and then we're going to talk about the editing. I think the compositions are very good. I think the editing is very good too, but there's some small areas for improvement. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about more finessed editing. So compositionally, really nice. Central composition, perfect reflection, 50-50 split, amazing clouds. I think those are mammatus formations you see up there, which tend to trail thunderstorms. So it's very, very simple and very effective. These rocks here maybe aren't ideally positioned, but actually there's very little contrast there, so it's not like they draw the eye. They almost blend into the pool there, so no problem with those really. That little bit creeping in at the bottom edge there, that needs to go, but that's a very minor point. And in general, I think the symmetrical composition is very effective, so good job there. Then this, a few more elements going on. There is a bit of a contrast between the foreground here on the left, which is detailed and interesting, particularly this log, and the empty space on the right. I guess in an ideal world, the clouds might be happening more over here, because then that would fill in this area, which is less interesting than the left-hand side of the image. So it is a little bit left heavy. But that said, I'd be perfectly happy shooting this composition myself. As I've said many times, composition does have to be about compromise to a degree, and I think this is a pretty happy one, broadly speaking. It's not perfect, but it's very, very rarely perfect, and otherwise I think this is a really, really excellent image. Okay, so a simple minimalist shot here. I actually really enjoy these images, which make a feature of the weather and light as opposed to the landscape. And compositionally, very effective. I love having tiny mountains or hills versus monstrous skies or seascapes. I think it's a very effective way of achieving a sense of vastness in a landscape and open skies and so on. So compositionally very good. Bit of underexposure there, and we'll get to that in a bit. And then this shot of Mono Lake. Mono Lake's actually one of the landscapes that I remember seeing the first landscapes I'd ever appreciated of actually. I used to be part of a forum called Fred Miranda, which still exists, and a lot of the landscapes pasted on there were of Mono Lake. So I've seen a fair number of these over the years, but this is a very nice one. Lovely winter scene here, and I would edit it slightly differently, and again, I'll get onto that later. But the composition's pretty good. These towers are interesting. Maybe it's a little bit right heavy. I mean, there is a lot of interest in this area here versus the left side of the image, but I don't think it's necessarily unbalanced. Perhaps you could have come in a little closer on this left edge and cropped in something like this. Might have balanced just slightly better. I always forget to release the shift key when I'm drawing these frames. There we go. So maybe that works a little bit better compositionally, but yeah, still a nice job there. And here we've got the classic S-bend leading line, these lovely paths that you get through the redwood trees in, I assume, California, and beautiful variation in the greens. This mist type effect at the top that's added, and that's another thing we're going to discuss in the editing. I would edit the greens a little differently as well, because I think they've become rather strong, but compositionally this is really beautiful, and I can't really fault it, to be perfectly honest. Okay, so let's get on to the meat of this and discuss some editing, and I'm going to do all of these edits, I think, in Lightroom. I've already had a little crack there, actually. So let's start with this one. Well, here's the raw that Renee sent me. I guess it's potentially already exposure bracketed, but that's her edit, and this is the original. So let's go into the develop module here, and I'm going to start by darkening the in fact, before we do that, let's discuss Renee's edit and what I might want to change here. So we have this beautiful structure in the clouds, but maybe the highlights were a little bit hot in the sort of bumps of mammatus here, and we might like to recover a bit more of that highlight detail to see if we can get a bit more structure into that cloud, because perhaps it's just slightly washed out. And then generally the rest of the image just looks a little bit dull, a little bit underexposed, and I think that's an interesting comparison to the second image, because I think the rendering of the mountains here is perhaps slightly more desirable. You've got that, I mean, I guess this is some form of quartzite rock, and it's got this like bone-like rendering to it, quite bright, which is possibly more reflective of the rock type, and I get the impression that this is the same rock, and maybe Renee's rendering of it here is just a little bit too dark. So I think I'd start by darkening the highlights for the sky here, and lifting the shadows and adding a bit of contrast, and then just seeing how bright I can keep things without blowing the sky out too much, and then just see if I can locally fix some areas in the sky. So I'm just going to darken the top portion of the image here. So I am darkening the peak as I do this, but as long as I don't go too far, it should be okay. So just half a stop there. In fact, maybe a little bit less than that. And then we can come in locally and just paint a slight darkening still into those brightest areas of the sky, and I wouldn't do too much more than that, to be honest. Maybe I'd try and find some more texture in the sky up here. So I'm dragging a gradient in, and I'm adding some contrast, and I'm going to brighten it up and just see if I can find some more textures, which I have to a certain degree. So that just helps with a flatter area of the sky, and there's a few dust spots we could clear up too, but I don't think we need to do that for the purposes of this video. And you could have a play around with brightening up the foreground and adding some contrast here as well, but I think, yeah, just a tiny bit of brightening is where I would leave it. And then we also need to correct the chromatic aberration here, so do that checkbox, and I think we're more or less done. But I mean, the really important thing here is looking at the different areas of the image that you want to accentuate, and doing that very carefully, and then I guess looking at the overall exposure and just getting it to that optimal point where you're not washing things out, but you're brightening things up subtly, and you're just lifting things and letting the image breathe a little bit more. And looking at those side by side again, actually, I think I'll get rid of that slight brightening adjustment for the foreground, because it's probably better to keep it darker. But I'm looking at the different areas of the image that I want to work just subtly differently, to make the most of it. And that's the general approach that I'm taking. But the clear issue with most photographers editing, and I'm not necessarily applying this to Renee, is not that they don't know how to use the tools, it's that they don't know what they're trying to achieve. And I think that thought process is pretty hard to learn sometimes. So let's look at this one, and Renee's edit versus the original raw file. Sorry, I'll just have to pop this stack open again. In fact, let's do the lot of them whilst we're at it. There we go. Done that one? No. So here's Renee's edit, and here is the original. So Renee's taken it in the right direction. We can see that we've brought back some of this highlight detail in the cloud, and we've lifted the foreground. So I think the edit is actually very nice. Maybe it looks a little bit flat in the foreground here, lacking a bit of contrast, a bit of micro contrast. So that's the very local contrast. But otherwise, I think this is really quite a nice edit. So I'm just going to go through how I would do things slightly differently here. So we're going to do the usual darken the highlights and lift the shadows, add some contrast. So that's my baseline for starting almost every edit. And then I'm going to brighten the image, and I'm just trying to keep it as bright as I can, thinking about how that's affecting the sky. So maybe I can darken the sky as much as possible. And you can see that I've actually used these sliders to their full effect. So I've gone -100, +100, which is not totally unusual for me, to be perfectly honest. And with lots of images, it doesn't produce artifacts or anything like that. So you don't need to worry about using those sliders to the maximum extent, as long as you're checking the image along the way, because occasionally they can introduce halos. So next thing, we want to see if we can bring back some more detail in the sky. So in theory, we won't get much out of the highlights slider here because we're already maxed out from the global adjustment, if you like. But I'll do that anyway, and then I'm going to darken just so that I get back that detail in the sky. And you can see that that isn't great in terms of it making this local area brighter compared to the rest of the sky. So we can do one of two things. We can either paint in the whole sky with a brush, or we can just locally adjust that area, which is what I'm going to do here, because I don't want this to be brighter than the rest of the sky. So I'm just painting in that area there, and I'm just going to locally darken it so that it doesn't look wrong. So I guess that's pretty close to where I would take it, to be honest. Again, very simple editing. You can see Renee's just starts to look a bit flat and plasticky by comparison because that contrast is missing, but her edit is also area, so maybe the rock rendering is nicer in her edit, so maybe we want to go somewhere between the two. We could look at just locally brightening these areas, for example, and reducing the contrast and lifting the exposure to get that white look to the rock, if you like. And obviously, if you do this a bit more carefully, then you can avoid the sort of haloing issues that I'm potentially introducing here. So that's more or less where I would go with that image in terms of what I'm aiming for. Another thing that's, I think, nicer about my edit, if you look at the colors in Renee's image, we've got sort of pink fringe going into a peachy color, going into some yellows. I think the color transition in this Lightroom edit is a little bit nicer, and maybe you could, if you wanted to achieve more color, just locally add saturation there. So that's where I'd stop with that one. Just working different areas in different ways. Now, this is going to be a more dramatic change we'll see in this edit here. Here's the original, and the original is almost preferable to the edit because there's no underexposure in the original. So let's just add a ridiculous amount of contrast to start off, because we're looking through some haziness here. And if we were to stop there, I think that is still an improvement because it's just a better exposure. But if we start working areas of the image more specifically, then I'm going to add some more contrast here and maybe drag the blacks down. So that's kind of adding more contrast still. And then I'm going to boost the exposure. And what I'm trying to achieve is to pop these blues without adding saturation. So I'm just adding contrast and then playing with the exposure. So I'm just trying to really make that area of the image sing. And then I'll drag a big gradient over the top just to darken it down a bit, and I'm going to add some more contrast. And I think that's quite nice now, and you could potentially play around with a gradient just to darken that bottom portion of the image as well, depending on exactly what you want to achieve. But I think stopping somewhere there is about right. And you could even look at setting a white point, which I would usually do in Photoshop. But if you're printing this, you really want it to be as bright as it can be. And so setting a white point is a good way to really lift the image. And suddenly we see a fairly enormous difference there in the two edits. And this one would print better because it's so much brighter. Okay, and then onto the mono lake image. Is this my edited version here? It possibly is, which might save us a bit of time. Yeah, so the one thing I noticed with Renee's edit is that I didn't actually think that adding the contrast and saturation to the sky was doing it any favors, because I think it just draws more attention to the sky and the local contrasts that you have there. And my inclination is to take a bit of color out and keep that contrast a lot lower, so don't deepen the sky quite so much, and I think that's then a better edit. So we're keeping a slightly lighter feel, which to me feels colder and fresher and perhaps more atmospheric for a winter image. This feels a bit more oppressive and dramatic, this edit, which to me isn't quite as in keeping with the subject matter. So that's why I went for a lighter edit there. And then finally, this image of the redwoods. I don't really like this kind of misty effect that's been added to the top portion of the image. I mean, it just doesn't look right, really. I mean, you're not going to see mist up here that's hiding this near redwood tree, but not see any down to the ground. There's no sense of depth created by that mist because it's just a little veil right in front of the viewer between us and the trees. There's no thickening of that mist going into the distance, so it does look artificial. There is a bit of an issue with the original RAW in that I think this is a light bleed here, so maybe the lens or filter wasn't quite clean because we're missing some of the contrast that I would expect to see in this top portion of the image, and I don't think that that's missed there. But comparing the two, one thing I wanted to talk about was how these greens are rendered in this final edit. It is quite impactful and saturated, and some people may love that. To me, it just looks a bit too much, a bit artificial, given how beautiful and rich these greens are naturally. So I think if I'm editing this, what I want to do is firstly just look at what the exposure does to the greens and try and hit a point at which those greens start to look at their richest without adding saturation, and then have a play around with white balance, because I think warming the white balance a little bit helps the greens come through and helps those yellows in particular show through. So I'm warming the white balance slightly there. And then you also want to have a play around with the green magenta slider. Now this is an interesting thing to talk about from a white balance perspective, because regularly if you shoot auto white balance in woodland, it's going to set quite a magenta tint to the white balance, and that's because it's trying to cancel out the light cast, the green cast in the light that comes from light filtering through a green canopy. So the camera is fighting that, and that's generally a beneficial thing because it allows that color separation in the green. So if I go crazy green white balance, then you start to see the yellows and apple greens look closer together because you are putting a green overlay almost over the top. So I do like to keep that magenta that an auto white balance will generally set in the image because it creates a better color separation. So once I've had a play around with the exposure and the white balance to try and get the greens looking at their best naturally, that's when I start to have a little play with saturation, and I will generally add just a little bit of vibrance. So, I mean, this is kind of boring in a way because I'm not doing anything particularly clever here, am I? I mean, I'm not doing really advanced editing, but I just think that this kind of edit is more in keeping with the natural beauty of the place than that original or Renee's edit, which is more impactful for sure, but I think you lose all these lovely colours in the foliage. And so that would be the direction that I take it. I do quite like this red in the path, incidentally, so maybe you could locally enhance that. And if you wanted to get rid of this haze in the top of the image, you can do that by setting black points and adjusting the blue channel in Photoshop. But I'm not going to go into that at this point because I think this video has maybe gone on enough. But some interesting images to edit there, and nice to go through some specific aspects of image editing and the thought processes. So thank you very much for sending those in, Renee.